So, Ms. Cecile Molinier, thank you very, very much for having taken the time to give the keynote address this morning. We really benefited from your presentation, in particular your insights in terms of the work of the United Nations Development Program. We're really convinced at the Institute that a very close link between also cultural diplomacy and development. And I think you really outlined some of those issues quite well in the lecture. So thank you very much for that. What I would like to do now is to ask you a few follow-up questions, in particular about the work of the UNDP and also as it relates to culture diplomacy. First question. The International Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy 2012 is dedicated to the theme of social, political, and economic inequality. We would like to know what measures the UNDP is taking in order to tackle the challenge of economic inequality. And I'd be grateful if you could even provide us with a few examples of the main objectives of the UNDP as it relates to the issue of economic inequality.
Well, economic inequality, the analysis of economic inequality, what causes it, and what policy measures could be taken to overcome it is at the heart of our mandate, because one of our four pillars is inclusive growth. And by inclusive, what do we mean? Precisely to analyze what could be an economic growth model that contributes to reducing gaps and inequalities rather than increasing them. So how do we do that? We are a field-based organization. 85% of our resources are at country level. So our policy recommendations would be very much evidence-based, and we will try to analyze what works in a number of countries, see to what extent it can be scaled up and replicated, and present it as good practices and discuss it with a multiplicity of stakeholders, because it takes more than UNDP and the national government to combat economic inequality. It is definitely a partnership endeavor. It is a multi-level and multi-stakeholder in the sense that all levels of government need to be involved, not only central but also subnational and national. All stakeholders in a country need to be involved, the people themselves, of course, and their elected representatives, but also the private sector, civil society, academia and think tanks. We do a lot of work with them, of course, because of their research capacity, and very importantly, the group of partners, development partners that support a country. Not only the UN, but also the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, the European Union, bilateral countries. So we work in that kind of multi-level and multi-stakeholder approach, and it is showing some very good results.
No, very similar to the field of cultural diplomacy, where again it's that power of partnership. One can't have a macro solution decided in some headquarters, but it really is how does one relate with the local partners at every level. So I think there are some similarities also with the field of cultural diplomacy. My second question, do you think that cultural diplomacy can support the important work of the UNDP, and what kind of measures is the UNDP currently taking to include cultural diplomacy research, theories, and practices into the work of the UNDP? And maybe if you could give an example in terms of how also UNDP is using cultural diplomacy in a direct or maybe indirect way.
Well, if I understood correctly, cultural diplomacy is very much about building trust and building bridges, and this is precisely what we are good at doing. We have very strong convening power. Why do we have that? Because as UNDP, having been in countries from the very beginning and having worked not only with the successive governments, but also with the population, with civil society, with a whole variety of institutions, and with the private sector, we have developed a capital of trust. And we also have the ability, in particular in crisis countries, to bring around the same table people who normally do not speak to each other. We have done a lot of work about how to promote dialogue in a context of crisis, hopefully in a context of preventing the crisis from erupting, but if a crisis and the instability is already very strong, how do we use dialogue and our convening power to encourage people to reflect together on what could be solutions to come out of a crisis? Within that context, I think it's extremely important to analyze and to work with power dynamics. whether it's between men and women, between the richest and the poorest segments of the population, between people of different origin. And just to conclude, we are also very much part of a partnership to address issues related to indigenous people, which is very relevant to cultural diplomacy, to inequality, and to inclusiveness.
I think there's a huge potential. You mentioned conflict situations, also post-conflict situations, in terms of really where reconciliation is needed before one can even begin, the development itself. I wonder if you could maybe share one example, maybe a favorite example that you're aware of, either in a reconciliation situation or a conflict situation, where you saw, their culture really mattered, or cultural diplomacy.
Let me give you an example. Kenya. You will recall that there was some very significant instability following a challenged presidential elections a few years ago. And what did UNDP do? We worked very, very closely with committees set up at the district level, decentralized level, to strengthen their own capacity to do their work, also to strengthen and to use early warning mechanisms. What would be indicators of a potential increase of conflict or resurgence of conflict? How would we work to make sure that those committees are aware of those potential causes of conflict? How can we help them bring people together early enough so that the conflict can be avoided? How do we bring those early warning signs to the central level so as to work also with the national authorities, with the state in addressing those issues? And I would argue, if we look at the way that the constitutional referendum was adopted overwhelmingly and without any instability or civil struggles, I would argue that the work we have been doing since the disputed presidential election during that period with those district level committees has contributed significantly to preventing instability and unrest. And this has the link with cultural diplomacy, as you know, in Kenya, but in a number of other countries, a major source of conflict is differences in ethnic or racial or social origin. And this, to me, is at the heart of cultural diplomacy.
And I'm sure it's necessary to overcome those challenges to really get the serious development work done. The final question that I have for you, the UNDP is engaged in economic fields, which can affect global politics and the political situation at the level of the state. And therefore, the UNDP has a significant amount of influence on the world's peace and stability. I'd like you to outline for us, in your opinion, the key roles of the UNDP in promoting democracy, global peace, and prosperity or stability.
And that is the second pillar of our mandate, which is democratic governance, which is a very wide concept. And basically, what does it mean for us as UNDP, given our mandate? It is, for instance, to strengthen the rule of law and democratic institutions. It is to build capacity at all levels within public administration, within a National Human Rights Commission. It would be how to work with the media in order to strengthen their capacity to monitor how the government works, how the parliament is doing its job. It means also working very extensively with civil society and community-based organizations, because we know that development is community-based and that it is a very iterative bottom-up but also top-down approach. The two have to merge, so to speak. It also means promoting human rights. Now, we are not the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We do not monitor the implementation of human rights. But what we do is that we contribute to strengthening the capacities of the national human rights commissions. We also contribute to the wider dissemination and awareness raising about human rights. To give you some examples, and that is political. We are not a political organization like the Department of Political Affairs. We work hand in hand with the Department of Political Affairs at country level, but the nature of our work is very political.
Yeah, of course.
And it is, as you said, about building trust in order to influence countries to follow a sustainable human development path. That's how I would like to summarize what we do.
Yeah, because it's just as much soft power attracting as well as it is.
It is soft power. We're not a bank. We're not a multilateral or a national development bank. We don't bring billions of dollars into a country, but we contribute to the reflection on what could be the best possible strategies and policies. And we do that by bringing very high quality expertise based precisely on what has worked in other countries. Hence, for instance, the interest of the work we do with Brazil. To give you one example, how we work with Brazil so that the Brazilian model of sustainable development can be better understood, better analyzed, and applied to the extent that it is applicable, or adapted, of course, clearly, to other countries' contexts.
Well, Ms. Molinier, thank you very, very much for having taken the time to come, and we look forward to collaborating with you in the future, as well as the UNDP.
Same here.
Thank you very much. Thank you.